Okay, welcome along to Memory Issues Month. I'm speaking with Elizabeth Johnson. Elizabeth, do you want to tell us a bit about what you do, and then we'll get started on memory?
Great, yes, and thank you for having me here, Emily. This is such a great and timely topic. And today, we mentioned before we kind of got started, it's 9/11 here in the United States. So it's September 11th, which everyone knows, but it seems like a really good day to talk about memory and memory challenges and why memory comes back to us. So I'm excited to chat today. I am a trauma educator and I'm a trauma coach. I talk and write a lot and teach about basically how sexual abuse affects relationships. And so that includes interpersonal relationships and all kinds of relationships, provider, client, patient relationships, yours, mine, ours, and trauma and memory are obviously a really big part of that. So one of the things that I say is I assume trauma and do my very best to proceed with kindness. So we'll chat about memory today, which I'm excited about.
Awesome. So, as you said, today is 9/11, which is, it's a day that's etched in everybody's memory
Yeah.
and ties in with the trauma thing as well. It's as though this was like meant to be.
Yes, I know. I think it is. And I was going to start out by saying, full disclosure, I'm not a mental health provider and I am not a healthcare professional or healthcare provider. So we will not be talking, unless you want to add that bit, very much about the sciencey parts of our brain and memory. Like that is not what we're here for. There's so many people who do a really nice job with that. And we can mention some of those resources if we have time at the end.
Mhm.
But that's not what we're going to be, that's not my scope. And so that's not really where I'm going to be tackling it. I think that when I think about memory and specifically around women in perimenopause, my first inclination is to think about trauma. And as I said, I think everyone is a trauma survivor. And so I kind of start with that premise. And so since this is, we don't, this is recorded and going to be accessed later on, but I'm going to put something out and I'm going to ask folks, and I'm going to start right here if it's okay with you, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and if you're listening later on at home or in your car, wherever you happen to be listening to, maybe you can just sort of like make some little mental ticks in your mind as I ask these questions. So here we go. Have any of the following things ever happened to you? Have you ever been bullied at work or harassed? Were you bullied as a child? Were you ever touched inappropriately or secretly in an unwanted way, sexual or otherwise? Have you ever experienced an act of interpersonal violence, or have you ever served in combat? Have you ever experienced the loss of a loved one, been involved in an accident, been targeted or threatened because of your identity or beliefs or something, race? Have you ever been present at someone's death or passing, including that of a patient or client, or diagnosed with a life-threatening illness or condition that you have to manage? Have you ever experienced a traumatic childbirth? Or have you ever been silenced or outed by someone that you trusted? Or have you ever been robbed, threatened with a weapon, something like that? So those are some examples of what I think of as little t, like a lowercase t trauma, and then big T, like a big uppercase T trauma. So big T is things like combat or rape, and smaller t, which smaller t, not necessarily in terms of um, mattering or scale or impact, but in terms of what people think of as, traumas that don't necessarily have a longer term impact, but they do for some people. So big T and little t trauma. So a little t trauma like bullying, and a big T trauma like rape or combat, something like that. So if those ring true for you, like if you're ticking yes to any of those, then you're a trauma survivor.
And the thing is also, yes, to the outside world, big T and little t is a differential, but actually to the individual, the impact can be just the same, can't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm teaching a training called When Survivors Give Birth in the fall, and I think it's one of the things that I sort of emphasize. It's for providers in some capacity to help. They're dealing with pregnant people or new families in any capacity, and so I emphasize that people get to define their own trauma. They get to define their own experience, own it or not. So I say across the board that everyone is a trauma survivor. I also accept that not everyone owns that or has that kind of identity or realizes or wants to. So absolutely, and part of the reason that I do the training that I do is that I believe that whether you were harmed as an adult or harmed as a child, the impact can be very similar. And the longer term effects can be very similar. And that's what I have found both in my own research and my own in my own experience, but also what I've been told from survivors with whom I've been working forever.
And for a lot of people, a lot of women, not those men who have perimenopause, for a lot of women, perimenopause, the hormonal change can be a time when that really brings it all back to the surface, can't it?
Yes. Yeah. Because I think that trauma comes back to us in one of two main ways. It comes back to us through a specific trigger, right? Like we are we need a vaccination. You know, we need to have something happen, like, and it could be so the trigger could be a needle. The trigger could be a scent that we're in a store or something like that, and we smell something that reminds us of a traumatic incident. It could, so a specific sort of trigger that's like an object or something. Or it can come back to us through what I call vulnerable times. And so vulnerable times are these non-everyday sort of days, times in our life. And so, like, I think of intimacy issues. I think of certainly childbirth. And even though it is an extended time, I count perimenopause as part of that time. It's not something we will be experiencing, although it seems like it sometimes we're in the midst of it for the rest of our life. But even though it can seem that way, it is something that's a non-everyday event. It's something that we have not always dealt with. And I think of COVID also as something that's a vulnerable time. It's this very weird space that we're existing in right now. And so I think that trauma comes back to us at these points. And when we have things like perimenopause and COVID kind of going in hand, it can be a really vulnerable time for people. And that's when past trauma can come back. And that's why things can feel even harder than they have before, or they may have felt in the past.
Yeah. And so how does that then impact with our memory? How does memory come into this?
Yeah, so I think that trauma never really goes away from us. So, like, there's points in our life where it's just not right at the surface, but there are points where it's going to come back. And so one of the ways that it comes back is through kind of going away from us, right? Is when there's a vulnerable point that we're in, a vulnerable time that we're in, things feel harder, they feel more stressful, and it is almost like it's trickier for us to grasp on that we have always kind of held true or have helped us in the past. And one of those things can be our memory, and so it can be memory in terms of memory kind of away from us, like just not remembering things that we used to, or it can be the other way around where we have memory coming back to us that we would not want coming back to us, like that cycling of thoughts, or that that constant anxiety, or a paranoia or a fear, so it comes back to us, I feel like, in different ways, and that's for me a connection in perimenopause. When I think about, when we look at even the Facebook page, right, even Perimenopause Hub, when we're looking at that, and people are saying, like, what are these symptoms that are kind of like, you had that post a couple of days ago, like, what are those big symptoms for you? Memory is always there, and it whether it's this piece around memory, like, I just don't remember, and like that feels scary to me, and what does that mean? Or if it's like memory in terms of, we use different language to talk about it, like it's like the anxiety.
So that's interesting,
so
because
intense.
Without going into much detail because it's not the place to, but I had an experience in the mid 2000s, which was definitely comes under the heading of traumatic, and buried it. Buried. And
Yes.
in the last 6 months, that has come back, and I have had to deal with it, and I feel much better for having dealt with it.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting how, I don't know, maybe it was the acceptance of understanding that I'm in perimenopause and that it's okay, that I was suddenly strong enough to deal with it, or what. But yeah, the memory suddenly was there.
Yeah, it is really I mean, I've heard from so many different women at different points, and I generally, I mean, our audience is only women, but for the most part, I deal only with women. I do talk to male survivors here and there, but for the most part, it's only women, and they all say the same thing. They have a memory that comes up that during this really scary time, whether it was breastfeeding, it was one breastfeeding for me, that there was something that came back, and I'm like, where is this coming from? Like, I haven't thought about this in decades, or I had talked to a woman who she had a hysterectomy. And it was then where everything literally came cascading back to her. And like childhood abuse and all kinds of things that she had some inkling that something was wrong. Was a child, and it was kind of like distant, and there was all kinds of other things happening, and she didn't really pay attention. And it was that sort of trigger in her life, this massive, operation that she had no idea. And I think that's also part of the problem when we come to think about things that are scary to us at different points, is that we don't have a lot of people we trust, like I would say trusted professionals, like healthcare providers or mental health people, saying, so at this point you may notice, like, so when I talk to providers, I'm thinking there's you're not going to get in for this overload of information, or you're not going to get it over your head or out of your scope of practice if you say a simple sentence like, intimacy can be challenging for sexual abuse survivors. And that's it. Or if you're an OBGYN, right? Childbirth can be challenging. And I know I keep the language very simple, but we just don't get that information. And so we don't know. And so then we don't know, we suffer alone, and then we're inclined to think that something is very wrong with us. And we see this show up in the Facebook page all the time. People are really, and understandably, I mean, I have been in that spot myself, but we're desperate to hear some sort of normalization of how we're feeling, some sort of affirmation that we're not afraid, and that this is happening indeed to other people.
And I suppose when we look at it like that, so if you're in the midst of unknowingly processing something that has happened in the past,
Yeah.
it stands to reason that your immediate short-term memory is going to struggle, isn't it? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's so
Yeah.
busy with the previous stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can only, I mean, there was so much interesting research around, like, how many relationships can we really maintain with other people and still have them be ones of quality? And I think it can't help but be true of, like, our mind too, like, right, we cannot track every single thing. And so this is one of the things that I'm like, so here's some things that you can do, because I really believe in, like, what can I do, how can I be more actionable? And one of them is, I feel like, something that you've often advocated, Emily, is like, let's write some stuff down, like, whether you're tracking your cycle, like we get it into it, like, when we've never done that before, but just this idea of keeping a journal or a notebook in some capacity, of saying, on this day, this is how I was feeling. Or on this day, for mine is very simple. Like, I worked out on this day. I was noticing I was super tired here. I had some spotting because it was the end of whatever, but when we track stuff down, it is a record of what has happened to us. And there's a lot of power in that. And it can be, I think, hard. I think it can be hard to accept, right? That there's some power in telling our story, but I really think this is true. And this is a way that we tell our story. And even, air quotes, even if it's just for us, that's
Yeah.
so important.
And I think there can be this belief, and this is a very female thing, I think, that our story isn't worthy, isn't valid,
Mm-hmm.
isn't
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
And actually, if you're journaling, it is only for you. You're
Yeah.
not writing it down with some um feeling that it's going to become the next great book out there, and that
Right.
people need to
Right.
know it. It's just
Yeah. Yeah.
you sort it through, isn't it?
Yeah. I think that's right. It is just for us. There's
Mm.
just, well, often don't feel worthy, and we often don't, I think we just don't recognize the power that there can be in writing things like that down. When we write that down, it's a record, of course, but, like, truth that happened to us that day. And so if we indeed do get, Like if we're writing things down and we're noticing, okay, so it's really around ovulation for me, or it's really around the week before I get my period that I am super forgetful, or that I have a very short temper, right? Then we start to recognize that it may not be early onset Alzheimer's, right? I may not be suffering from dementia. It may be something that's hormonal. And while that sounds sort of obvious to say, maybe in our company or with others, but like that is a huge revelation for people, you know, that it's not this, I'm not feeling the same way every single day. But it's also this great because we can recognize patterns. So we feel when we can recognize the patterns, feel more in control. And if things we're seeing that there are patterns, or we're seeing that, oh my gosh, this is something like I'm just not remembering more. I'm not remember like the days where I have a hard time remembering are more than the days that I do. Then maybe then we have our doc journal that we can take to a trusted provider and say, so here's what I'm noticing. I've tracked this for whatever, a month, 2 months, whatever, however long, and it can be this sort of helpful guide for that other for person to give us some expert advice if we do start to feel concerned. So it's such a great tool.
Absolutely. And it validates what's happening, doesn't it? And also, by writing it down, you often start to realize that actually it's only 20% of the time or whatever. But
Yes.
because we're drawn to focusing on the sort of the feeling negative, the feeling bad,
Yeah.
actually once we start to see that it isn't all the time, that's
Yes.
so liberating.
It's so liberating. And things immediately, I mean, not going to say for everyone, but they can immediately feel less. And it is so hard when we're in something to not feel frightened. And it's completely frightening to have, whether it's memories sort of cycling back to you, you know, as you mentioned, and as we've mentioned, that need to kind of be addressed and dealt with in a way. If it's things that we just like more like basic things, like I just remembered these things that I feel like I used to remember or recall that name of that book. You know, there's just a lot of power in us feeling more confident with, because we've recognized a pattern, because we wrote it down, and now we're like it's just like and that's a huge thing, I think.
Yeah. And I'm just this keeps shouting that it wants me to say it, so I'm going to say it. And
Yes,
this is just
yes, that's great.
a silly thing about memory, but this is something that my partner and I always joke about. If we forget something just day to day, like I don't know, where do I put the car keys or something really silly, you know,
Yeah.
and then we'll go, yeah, but you might have forgotten that, but you remember all of the ABBA lyrics, right?
Yes,
Or you
that's
don't,
right.
you know, there's a finite amount of space in there, and
There's a
there are
finite
some
amount of
things you can't
space.
get rid of. And
Hmm.
is this an
Hmm.
important memory, or should I just bin it?
Right, right. That's so true. And I think that, I mean, it's like, what are those important pieces? Like, are we, you know, are we not like these pieces that we find so beautiful, right? Like the lyrics to a song, or that favorite line in a movie that we saw. You know, I think those are just such beautiful pieces. And again, if it feels like we can't remember some of those beloved pieces, then maybe that's something to pay attention to. But, you know, maybe we can if we just recognize, okay, it's at this point where I can't, you know, and that can be different. That can change our whole outlook on how we feel, which
Yeah.
I think so there's this idea, I feel like, of writing things down when we think about memory, but I also think it's really important to remind ourselves of what we can control. Because that's something that we tend to like. Memory for me tends to be a spiral, and it can be a real spiral for lots of survivors. You know, if things are really bad, we're kind of feeling like we're in the middle of it. We're not feeling safe or healthy. And so we kind of get really like in a low point. And if we're feeling like things around memory can just exacerbate that, you know, like everything just makes everything else worse, especially when it's tender.
Mhm.
So I like the idea of trying to remind ourselves what we do have control over. You know, like if I am scared or concerned enough, I can make an appointment with my GP, right? Or I can also, if I'm feeling overwhelmed by the world and maybe I'm not remembering like our latest COVID information or something like that, I can turn something off. And do I have to remember these things? Like, is this important? Because we've said this, and I think it's really important to say again, there's a finite amount of space for some of this stuff. There just is. I mean, that's just habits, so we can't always have that. But when we think about how much we can control, control is power, right? Control helps us feel more powerful about our life. And so this kind of goes to the self-efficacy piece, which I think is always so important to kind of remind ourselves. I can control, maybe there's a sleep piece that's maybe we feel like is my lack of sleep interfering with my memory issues. Okay, so what can I control that would help me feel better perhaps about that piece? I can turn my light off earlier. I can shut that phone down earlier, things like that.
And also, when you think about the COVID stuff and you think about 9/11 and all these big things, actually one of the things we can control is how much news we actually take in about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, at the start of COVID, over here certainly, they had a daily press release, and every day we were just being bombarded with this information.
Yeah.
And I got to the point I couldn't watch because it was beyond. I can't control that. I can only do what I can do, and at that point, it was stay at home.
Yep.
Doing that.
Yes.
I didn't need to know any more about it, And
no, that's right.
I think the self-care comes in at setting that boundary as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so too. I think that when we exert some control over the choices that we make, we're taking better care of ourselves, we're setting boundaries, and we're expanding, I believe, our feelings of safety in the world, about ourselves in the world, right? There's so much that we can't control, but when I make intentional choices, I'm not going to go to this place because I feel like they don't stick with the mask wearing, or I'm not going to engage in this thing because it doesn't feel safe to me or whatever. But we expand of safety when we exert some control over the choices that we have. And I think that's super important for anyone, but especially for perimenopausal women, because there's so many daily challenges and there's so many symptoms that are interfering. But like, okay, so what are these pieces that I can kind of manage a little bit myself?
Yeah, and certainly
multitasking. I do want. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, carry on.
I was just wanted to say, multitasking does not help us, which we
exactly
probably all know.
I was about to say something very similar. That
funny.
when we're in perimenopause, actually having a really simple routine helps us. Gives us back that control.
Yes.
And okay, this is how this works, and and I'm not going to try and do all of the things all of the time. I'm going to do them one after another. So yeah, I was about to say exactly the same as you.
That's so fun. Great minds think alike, and we're remembering it. Yeah, multitasking is like so not good. Like it really, we know that it's not good for our brain. There's a ton of research out there, and it can definitely impact our memory as we get older. So not only are we like less productive and less, less focused and all these other pieces, but like literally memory can change. And so this is a very, like, there's a ton of research around that out there. And that's if people are, if you memory as you're in perimenopause, in some ways you probably should be, because you're probably multitasking a lot, and it's just like, the things, it's just like across the board, Emily, the things that we could do at 25, 28, whether it's, boozing it up at night or whatever we're doing, like we just can't do 20 years down the road anymore. Our bodies just, it doesn't work that way. So pause the multitasking if we can do that. Keeping that simple routine, I think, is really crucial. It's funny how much of this goes back to like these simple, not easy necessarily, but like some of these simple steps. Let's write some stuff down. Let's remember what we have control over. Let's keep to a more of a basic routine.
Yeah. And, just forgiving ourselves when we do forget stuff.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah. Yes. I find one of the ways, I think this self-forgiveness piece is super hard for us. And I think one of the, there's so many reasons why it's hard, but I think one thing that we can kind of, that works in our favor with this is something I feel like I always champion, which is really finding our right people, checking in with our right people, right? Our right people will also be those people who are noticing that something is off with us, right? Maybe perhaps our memory is off, like, because those are, whether partners or friends or whomever those people are, but those are people who often notice us because they're paying super close attention. They give as much as they get, right? And so they're tuned into us and we are tuned into them. So sometimes those people are really awesome people to in with for a reality check, for that sort of gentle reminder of like to be more forgiving ourselves. but also because they pay close attention, they might be able to pick up on something that we don't, or we have a suspicion around, and they can help with that too.
Yeah. And they will always see the good in us, whereas we
And they
might
will
only
always
see
see
the
the
bad
good
in
in
us.
us. That's right. That is like part of their whole thing. That's why they're one of our right people, and these people, like, we can just be honest with them. I had to take my child to the doctor, whatever, like a month or so ago, because she was just had a high fever and all kinds of stuff. And all I can think of course, is like, this child has COVID. Like, she's got COVID. And so we go to the doctor, they see us outside, like, it's amazing, like inside a building. And end of it, I had texted my husband. I was like, they're not testing her for COVID. And he's like, why not? And I'm like, I don't even know. I'm like so freaked out by this whole thing. We think it's an ear infection and whatever. And I was like, why are she not being tested for COVID? Like, now, like, why are we not doing that? And they're like, well, one of the things that we're seeing in children is rashes, and she does not have any rash at all. And what you're telling me, based on her health history, is that this has happened to her before, and it's very similar. And I was like, oh, great. Okay, yeah, that's right. And so, like, it was just this spurring of like, okay, you're eh, right people, right? Like, I totally trust this person. And so I was like, you feel safe enough to say this thing that's scary, like, should you not be testing her for COVID? Oh, you're not going to? Here's why. Oh, great. Right?
Yeah,
Like, there's so much validation that can come, or affirmation, or which is so beautiful.
yeah, absolutely. And your right people don't
Mm-hmm.
mind if you don't find the right word in the middle of the sentence. and
Never. No, they don't.
and they're not going to, we ourselves will beat ourselves up about it. Go, oh, I'm so useless, I can't remember anything, blah blah blah, um and your right people would never judge.
No. Nope, they never judge. They never judge, and you do the same thing for them, right? Like, you mirror that back to them, which is just like some of the there's so much power in our right people, and it just shows up all over the place, and so just it's amazing. It's just these simple things, right? Like, we come back to a couple of simple things, whether it's, a simple routine, reminding you what have control over, like, but so much of this stuff is, okay, this is a good sort of like rule for memory, or whether it's, like, self-care, forgiveness, or, whatever, any of these other pieces, which I think are so crucial. But right people all over the place.
But it all ties in together, because self-care, you're in a stronger place to start remembering things again.
Mhm.
Putting your boundaries, you're in a stronger place to start remembering things again. It
Yes.
all ties in, doesn't it?
Yeah,
and,
it's
and
beautiful.
ultimately,
It's
as I've
beautiful.
said, as long as the ABBA lyrics are still in there, it's okay.
Uh-huh. Then you're fine. You are
Yeah.
fine. That's right. That's all you need. I mean, at the bottom line is that's going to get you through the day. Come on now. That's like real. But I think the thing that I want to add, because I'm conscious of our time, but I want to remind people that, which is something that, again, our right people probably remind us of this in their own way. I feel like this is not necessarily mainstream out there, but you know yourself best. You just do. Like, you may not be an expert in any other thing in the world, and you don't need to be, but you know yourself best. And one of the ways that we can start to remind ourselves of that is when we write some stuff down, right? Like, okay, yeah, this is true. I wrote it down here, and this is what I don't think we hear enough from our healthcare mental health people, that they do know that we do, right? Know ourselves best. They are the one who knows the disease and the illness and the symptoms and things like that. But that is not training that they get to sort of put that beautiful belief of ownership back onto the person, and the patient or the client in front of them, and say, you know yourself best. What do you think is the thing that you need right now? So I just want to remind everyone who's listening to this that they do know themselves best. You may not know anything else that you feel like is like you got it down as the expert, but you do know you. And there's so many ways to kind of like help us develop that listening skill. But we do know ourselves best, and that's a lot of power there.
Yeah, and that's where the journaling and the tracking absolutely brings that to
Yes,
the forefront, doesn't it? And
absolutely.
brings
Yep.
that huge superpower out of you, and gives you that thing to show to the doctor, and to,
Yes,
it's a superpower.
it is a superpower. Yep, it absolutely is. I feel like I do tell, and it's kind of maybe an odd thing, but sometimes it is something that's helpful for people, is that, I think that trauma survivors do have a little bit of a piece of something that others do not, which then, if everyone's a trauma survivor, everyone's got a little piece that can kind of be developed. But it's like they have this extra sense, right? They have an extra sense of something. So it's like a little bit of a gift that is in there because of what they've experienced. And for whatever that gift, that's their own figuring out of way of what that gift is. But there is a little bit of something in there that I think can be really powerful to people to seize and to hold on to and say, this is part of my, part of what I can use moving forward. One of those tools.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. You're so welcome. What was I going to? I have not. So I'm mentioning it with the caveat that I have not read it yet, but I heard it's phenomenal. And it's a book called The Double X Brain by Lisa Mosconi, and I have it on order. But it is about women, perimenopause, and memory. It was sort of recommended to me, and mine has not yet arrived. That is one. And I also like The Wisdom of Menopause, of course, by Chris Northrup, which also talks about memory. So there's a lot more sciencey stuff out there, obviously not chatting about, but just for people who are like curious about that kind of thing, those are two resources that are one that I love and one that is coming my way that I heard great things about.
Yeah, Dr. Mosconi, her work is amazing.
Yeah, food one. I think now I'm blanking on what the name of it is, but I read the food one. It was fabulous. And I think this is her newer one. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah.
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 Awesome.
Thank you so much. This was so much
Thank
fun as
you.
always.
Yay.